So my name's Laura Addison. Welcome to everyone. I want to thank Charlotte and Liana of Charlotte Jackson Fine Art, and of course, Eva Borens and the entire board of the New Mexico Committee of the National Museum of Women in the Arts for putting on this event and for inviting me to partake in it each year. And I want to thank, of course, the panelists, Natalie, Carola, and Rose for participating and for sharing their stories of growing up in a highly creative environment, nurtured by parents who were great role models in pursuing a life as an artist and who nurtured the same in their children. Each of our panelists today grew up in families where being a visual artist or a writer or an actor or a musician is as natural as breathing. It may challenge you and at other times frustrate or frighten, but each of the panelists today has demonstrated that pursuing a life immersed in the arts is part of their DNA. Apart from the question of art being second nature is the question of environment. I hope that we've all had the good fortune of having a teacher in our life who has recognized some sort of innate ability or talent or skill in us and has nurtured that so that we can maximize our potential. And I think that we see that here today. So it's not just parents who are nurturing this environment for their children, but teachers, whether these be in a very formal environment or whether it be more informal, as in family relations or a mentor of some sort. And it's not just the parents, but it's also their parents' peers, is what I found in talking to the three artists preparing for today's panel. As well as any number of generations. So this panel is called Second Generation, but with Rose and Carola, for example, there are multiple generations. There are aunts and uncles and grandparents, great-grandparents, cousins, siblings. And so it's bringing together of all of these different generational experiences that has helped to form the artists that these three women are today. And this is what in Natalie's, for the show for Natalie's upcoming exhibition at Charlotte Jackson, what the press release refers to as an apprenticeship of daily life experience. I really like that phrase. So I think that as a result of today's panel, what we'll see is that to the question, is creativity a function of nature or of nurture? The answer is a resounding yes. What I also noticed in talking to the three artists today is that each has a very multidisciplinary approach to their lives, to leading a creative life. And that the evidence of that takes many forms. So for Rose, for example, I think most of us probably know her as a figurative sculptor. But in fact, she's done many different art forms. When I first knew her work, she was a musician. And there's rumors of a reunion of Chocolate Helicopter coming out. That was the name of her band. And you heard the list of some of the other things that she's done. She's a drawer, she's a printmaker, she's done murals, she's worked with traditional foodways. She is presently working on her a degree in creative writing at IAI, and she's done auto body work, which she approaches as a creative endeavor. Carola was a musician before she came to photography. And then she studied political science, and she had wanted to become a lawyer. She went to law school, thought better of it, and then turned to photography. Natalie has always bridged art and science. She sees science as a practice of creative problem solving, and so really they aren't as disparate as one might think art and science would be. And she may well be going on to study marine biology, getting her PhD. She has a master's in environmental science and is thinking of potentially pursuing a PhD in marine biology. And you can see this reflected in many of the subject matter of much of her work. So now, I want to start by asking each of the artists to really talk about biography, looking specifically, sharing with the group your background, specific to growing up in a creative family life. How many generations in your family are artists or writers or other creatives? And how did this environment shape your own interests and pique your curiosity? Do you want to start, Natalie?
Sure. So as Laura said, I grew up in a household with a writer mother and a painter father. And it's funny, one of the questions that you sent us to think about was, at what point in life did we realize that our childhood was maybe unusual or not the typical experience of our peers? And it's funny, growing up, I mean, both of my parents, my dad go to work every morning. He calls being a painter his factory job and would go into his studio and create all day. And my mom, being a writer, she often would go sit in her office and work on her craft as well. And they both encouraged me to be creative. My childhood bedroom had wooden floors, and I had paints and clay and all sorts of things, as opposed to many of the usual childhood toys. But it wasn't something that I was ever pressured into. It was cultivated in a way that just encouraged my natural proclivity to creativity, I guess. But
can you talk about your interest in science also? And
sure, yeah. So I have wanted to be a marine biologist since I was 7 years old. There's one morning we went, I grew up on the beach in Southern California, and we went snorkeling on New Year's Day, and there was an aggregation of leopard sharks. And we got out of the water, and I turned to my parents and said, I'm going to be a shark biologist. And I never gave up on that, and so I now work in a lab that studies shark and tuna migration and behavior. And always wanted to be a scientist, but that artistic part of my personality is something that has always needed to be fed, and I didn't think that I would ever be a professional artist. It's something that kind of, part of my personality that insisted on not being ignored, and I have been lucky enough to pursue both professions.
Great. Carola?
Well, so I also grew up in a family where there were a lot of very creative people, not only in the family, but also people coming in and out of our household for dinners or, formal or informal visits. And I think that all of that really had an influence on me in terms of, I think that really it was the attention that was paid to what I was doing, sort of my own volition. I grew up, music was a very important part of my life from as early as I can remember. That and also the visual arts. And I think that the fact that people paid attention to what it was that I was doing let me know that it was uniquely valuable and distinct to me and different. It was really sort of something of my own that was not, wasn't what my father was doing, it wasn't what my brother was doing. My brother is also an artist, he's a sculptor. But I think that going back, several generations to some of the other people who were in the arts in my family, I think it made it clear that this was a viable way to go through life. And it was also a way to draw from all aspects of my life. And so, Laura, you mentioned that I went to law school for a short amount of time. And I was very interested in it, but it wasn't something that I really cared about. And I think at some point, I got a very bad flu when I was in law school. And I realized at that point that even in that state, I could still make a really good painting. But I couldn't bring myself to study for the next exam. So that was sort of a very clear indication, that I had to own up to the fact that I was an artist and there really was no choice for me, even if I wanted to make a different choice. And actually I didn't, it's not that I would have wanted to choose differently, it's just that was kind of a moment where it became clear that I had to own up to the fact of what I was and make it work.
So that decision had to do with a fever?
Yeah, the good old flu.
So do you see
I always
any, is there anything that you took from being in law school and studying political science that carried over into creative life?
Yes, definitely. I think that really one of the things that I do in my work is to look for underlying principles, something that is, so it's not just about making a good painting or what I'm photographing. It's how a certain principle might manifest itself in many different ways. And in fact, actually, for my application to law school, I wrote an essay about the similarities between painting and practicing law. So we can get into those details later maybe, but I always was kind of looking for the underlying principles, and I think that's a lot of what comes into play now in so much of my work. People for a long time were saying, are you really a photographer, or are you really a painter, or are you really a musician? And the answer was, as you said, yes. It was all of those things, and it's not so much that I have to choose between one or another. It's that they all feed into my understanding of something much larger and greater that can then be explored and expressed in many different mediums.
So as a painter and photographer, you are essentially self-taught?
I am, yes. My
only no formal training?
Yeah, my only formal training in the arts is as a classical pianist.
And Natalie, you like to say that you attended the Arnoldi School of Art?
Yes, it's very prestigious.
But in terms of formal training in the arts?
Very minimal.
So Rose, tell us a little bit about your background.
When I was in 3rd grade, I went to Santa Clara Day School, and I remember one of the girls in the classroom, her mom was the manager at Sonic in Española, and I was shocked because I thought everybody's parents sat around and made art. Because in the Pueblo, that's how most of my extended family made a living, was they sat in their kitchens making pottery and firing them in the yard. And it just blew my mind that someone's parent could actually have like a job that they got in their car and drove to, and it wasn't strictly dependent on the Santa Fe Indian Market. I remember when people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I wanted to fly fighter jets really bad. That was I had all these model airplanes that I hung in my bedroom, till I realized that in order to do that, you have to kill people, and I just couldn't do that. And part of also, I think, why I went the path of arts is reverse psychology, because my mom was like making her living off of her ceramic works, and that time was very intense because that was our livelihood. And so I was like, can I have a piece of clay? Can I have a piece of clay? Can I have a piece of clay? And she'd give me like this much, you know what I mean? And I eat it. So, and I felt like
So it literally nourished you?
It literally nourished me. Yeah, I was really made of clay, but it was more like, don't touch that. That's what grown-ups do, and that's our living. It's not fun. It's the living kind of thing. And so the reverse psychology was, you can't have that. So of course that's what I wanted to do. And I would look at my mom's pieces, and I always wanted to help. And she would have to build a big fence around her sculptures, so Rose wouldn't get involved, which often led into disastrous situations. And on the other side, my father Patrick Simpson is a wood and metal artist, and he was incredibly, what he did for me was he would always be like, we were always in adventures and ideas and things we wanted to do. We'd go into the shop and like build stuff together, and he'd always be like, I had a doll and I needed a car, so we'd be like, okay, how do we make a car out of wood? And between the two of them, I'm sitting there watching my mom use a chainsaw and fix the truck, and then watching my dad like really be excited about a project together that we could do. It made me really feel like nothing is impossible. You can do whatever you want, and it doesn't matter your gender, it was my mom who fixed the car and had the chainsaw. It was, there was everything. I was shown that if you put your mind to something, you can do it. Build a house, grow your own food, make your art, make a living off of it. And I think that's, it was brought up. It puts you in a mindset that you think it is possible. And when I went to graduate school at RISD, I realized that a lot of these people were fighting against their families who were like, "You're going to art school, why?" Right? And I didn't have that inside of my system at all. That actually was, as a Pueblo person, expected of you in order to make a living. That was the option. It wasn't something like, oh, you're not going to become a lawyer or doctor or something, you're going to be an artist. Oh, dude, right? And so I feel like I was incredibly blessed and supported.
Was it a hard decision? I sort of recall it was a hard decision to go to RISD.
Yeah, it was. But I also, I come from Santa Fe, right, for hundreds of generations in a sense. And I felt very stuck in sort of an idea when I was here. And I wasn't able to really express myself and see who Rose is because I was sort of entrenched in this family line, in this lineage that was like very incredibly powerful and strong in this area specifically. And I wanted to go to get away and be anonymous. I wanted to be anonymous completely. And I went to RISD specifically to be nobody and to see what happens when I could release my relationship to family and culture and all the in a sense, baggage in ways that you could see it as. And when I got there, I realized that it wasn't a negative thing, that it was actually an incredibly powerful foundation, and I'm really blessed to have that. And it was kind of unexpected for me to realize that. I also had an incredible experience where Arlene Sheckett walked into my studio and Arlene Sheckett is a profound ceramicist, and she said, "I know who you are." And she said, "You came here to do what?" And she says, "I already know you can play the game. You didn't come here to play the game, you came here to push yourself." And it was shocking to have someone I really respected already know who I was and to call me out on my playing this game, in a sense. It was cool. But in that sense, I've had an incredible community, an incredible family, and not just in the Pueblo world, but also in this world, in this contemporary Santa Fe art scene that has supported me and challenged me in so many ways, that my family is not just the few small people, but it's actually a tribe of larger artistic and creative people.
Thank you. Are there any particular lessons that any of you has learned from your creative parent about how to be an artist? And I'm not really talking about the business of being an artist, although it could be that also. I know that Carola, your dad, likes to expound on life philosophies, and so I imagine he imparted certain lessons to you.
Yes, I think that's true. I think it's true to a great degree, actually. I think that probably the most important sort of lesson that I could talk about here would be the importance of integrity in what you're doing, not trying to basically feed the market. I think that we're both very intuitive in our approach to our work, and I think that that is definitely, I think, something that probably was kind of I absorbed by osmosis growing up from him. I think that, he also, at a certain point, stopped showing with commercial galleries and very much wanted to do things on his own terms. And a few years ago, I also actually decided to take a break from exhibiting with galleries. I had shown with a number of different galleries, and I decided I needed to pull back a bit to develop several projects that were, well, at this point, they're long-standing projects, and I think that in some ways, probably the decision to do that could be traced back to some of those early lessons, and him as an example in terms of how he goes about his work. So not feeling like I had to constantly be sort of visible, and not feeling like I constantly had to be showing. And during that period, I had different opportunities to show with different galleries, but I felt like it wasn't if it wasn't the right fit, I didn't want to do it. It's kind of like getting married. It's an important relationship, and so I think that probably the ability to say no, and really the focus on the integrity of the work itself, and knowing when it was ready to show and ready to present, and not doing so prematurely. I think that's a big part of it. But so I'd say that, plus sort of the intuitive approach to my work. There are differences. Maybe we'll get into that later. But I would say that is a very important component of what I do.
Now, do you each solicit the feedback of your parents?
I definitely show him what I do. I had somebody ask me at a dinner party recently whether we critique each other's work. And, my first reaction to that word, critiquing, it sounds so art school, and it definitely is not like that. I wouldn't call it that. But with that said, I definitely share with him what I'm doing. I just showed him some proofs yesterday, actually, that I had just finished in LA. But so there's definitely some input.
Now, Natalie, you've talked about that your dad had a very subtle way of sort of helping shape you as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that a little more?
Sure. To answer your first question, I was just thinking about, I think the biggest lesson that I took from my dad is being an artist. A lot of people think of being an artist as this romantic, easy lifestyle, which couldn't be any farther from the truth. And to be an artist, really you have to show up every morning and be in the studio and work hard, and it is a job. And some days you don't feel like painting, or you don't feel like creating, and that persistence really is essential to being a successful artist, and I learned that from my dad. But yes, so from early on, there were subtle encouragements, and it's also another funny thing that occurred to me as listening to the two of you talk about growing up in a creative family. It kind of sounds like we each rebelled a little bit, and usually you think of, in most families, becoming an artist is a form of rebellion, but I went to college and became a biology major, you went to law school, and you went off touristy. And so it's funny to think of, coming from a creative family, how taking a non-artistic path was our form of rebellion or leaving. So that's interesting. Okay, so back to being cultivated as an artist. My parents were always hugely supportive of me becoming an artist. But I also had a lot of people in my life, and mostly friends of my parents who are artists, and I grew up in a big artist community in California, encouraged me not to be an artist. Are you crazy? Why would you ever submit yourself to that lifestyle and that amount of self-doubt? But my parents were always supportive, and it's funny, the later in life I got, and the more clear it became that this was something that was, I am an artist, and there's no, I think you said I came to the realization I am what I am, and I am an artist. I think I am also a scientist, and there were moments when I'd call home from college and I'm going to fail chemistry, I'm not smart enough to be a scientist, and my dad would say, oh, that's okay, just come home and be an artist. Which was not helpful in that moment. But yeah, they have always been hugely encouraging of me in my process and my practice as an artist.
So it's pretty clear that it's can only be helpful in some ways to have a parent who's worked in the arts, but have you ever had difficulty forging your own identity apart from them? Like, not just Roxanne and Patrick's daughter, or Bill's daughter, or Chuck's daughter, but as Rose, or Carola, or Natalie.
Should I?
Go right ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. I think mostly there is a very tender space between respect and self-awareness and finding oneself. I made a choice when I was really young, when I was waiting at Santa Fe Indian Market to talk to my mom. And there had been people camped in her booth for 2 days, and a sign-up sheet to who got to buy her work first. And I was hungry, and I needed to get to my mom to get some money to go get a fried bread. And I couldn't get to her because the people were pushing me out of the way. And I stood there and I stood back and I said, I will never show at a place like this. And this is so distasteful to me. And I made it a choice for myself because also I have struggled with identity issues, being an indigenous person and also being of mixed identity and mixed race, that I wanted to challenge the genocidal constructs of the CIB, which is a Certificate of Indian Blood. And so I wanted to show my work and be a part of a bigger art world and not just stuck in this Indian art world specifically, because there were many things about it that I found incredibly distasteful. And this is where I had to be very, very, very careful, because that world and that attention and desire for indigenous artwork is what fed me for my life. And not just what fed me, but my mother and my cousins and my aunties and my uncles and my grandmas. Everyone was fed by this community. Not only did it feed us, literally, but it actually supported and maintained the proliferation of beautiful art and the cultural preservation in a lot of ways. And so as I went through phases where I was like, and really speaking out about how I felt about the way that Native art was very ghettoized in a lot of ways, and there's a glass ceiling for that. And part of that, me wanting to not be stuck in that world and be like, see me as an artist, see me as Rose, who's all these things. I'm not just from Santa Clara Pueblo. I'm also from Española, which is the lowrider capital of the world, and I love cars, and I want to drive fast, and I want to drive slow, and I have a Harley, and I want to do this and that, and like all these things. I'm a skateboarder, a punk rock, a rock climber, all these things, right? And I'm not just one thing, and I fought so hard to not be stuck in that specific world, and yet to hold respect and appreciation for how it nurtured me and allowed me to be who I am. And I also see it as a responsibility to be sort of on the edge of that bubble and to be, as we become who we are, to be able to speak for that with a sense of entitlement that our parents didn't necessarily have and where they came from. And they might have struggled, my mom struggled to be a contemporary artist in a traditional Native world, right, to get where she is. And now I have a responsibility to push that dialogue even further, but in a respectful manner. That's great.
That was beautifully said, first of all. The question was, is there ever a tension? Is that right? If trying
has it been
to...
hard for you to forge an identity for yourself on your own, as opposed to always being.
Yeah, I think that it works both ways, like most things. I mean, it certainly helped in the early days to get some doors opened. Just to get somebody to look at my work at the very beginning, and I would say that the more difficult aspects of it probably came into play a little bit more in Santa Fe than in other cities. I think in part also because one of the mediums I was working in, especially in the early days of my work, was black and white photography, which is my father's medium, and so I think that inevitably people would start to say, well, she's walking in his footsteps, and things like that. And it was always important to me from a very young age that I only do something if I wanted to do it, and it had to be mine. That was sort of a really big thing to me when I was little. All throughout my life, I would never play piano. I would never practice piano because I was told to practice. I would play because I loved to play, and I couldn't help but play. I needed to play. I felt the same way about painting and also photography. So I think that coming from a creative family, I would say probably there are a few differences. Rose, you came from a family where a lot of people were working in ceramics. In my family, there were, dancers and actors, and, my mother is English literature professor, she was, and, so I started off in music, and that was kind of my thing, but it kind of grew to encompass a lot of different mediums, and I think that partly by virtue of that, I was able to differentiate what I was doing from what my father was doing. But it definitely came to a head at a certain point for me where I really felt like I had to contextualize what it was that I was doing, what I am doing, in a way that is distinct to me. And so that, I think, was part of what was behind the idea of pulling back for a little bit. Ended up being about 5 years. But I think the short answer is that I would only do this if it were mine. And I think that probably a lot of people coming from creative families feel that way.
So when you left law school, why didn't you go back to music?
I had actually already separated myself from music. That's sort of another story. But I had, at some point, I started college as a music major and found that the teachers that I had at UC San Diego were not, I didn't have the same respect for them as artists as I had for an excellent pianist who's actually here in town named Jan Pittelzak, who's quite a remarkable pianist. And so I had decided at that point to actually stop that trajectory. And that was when more of the visual arts came into the fore. I had always been doing visual arts, but they came to the fore at that point. And so when I left law school, I went back to the visual arts, or not back to, but I actually had my first exhibit sort of 2 months after I left law school. So then one thing led to another, and that's where I went. But I draw from everything. I draw from all of my life experiences as an artist, and I think that that's one of the best parts of being an artist. It makes use of all parts of life.
So So Natalie, how have you navigated to find that, what Rose called the tender space between respect for your elders and self-awareness?
Well, it has been hugely positive, I'd say mostly a great experience for me to be my father's daughter, but it is challenging to go out in the world and meet someone and say, oh, I'm familiar with your work. You're Chuck Arnoldi's daughter, aren't you? I love your paintings. And there is this tension between the huge benefits that I've had from being my father's daughter, but also kind of this inescapable, I don't want to say shadow because it hasn't been negative, but there is this association always, which early on when I started showing, there was this almost sort of guilt that I felt battling with. To what degree how much of this can I take ownership over my own success, and how much of this do I owe to being related to this incredible artist? And it's difficult to navigate as an artist's child, but my work is very different from my father's, which I think is one of the reasons why I've been able to maintain that integrity in my work. But yeah, it is a struggle, but it has been, I don't have a negative feeling about being known as my father's daughter.
Do you have a sense that the challenges of being an artist today for you and your generation are different than it was for your parents, your dad?
Absolutely, I would guess so. Yeah, it's interesting in particular being a woman artist and being my father's daughter as opposed to my father's son. But yeah, he came up at a very different time and was an artist in Venice, California in the 70s and 80s, which was a very different art world and a very different atmosphere than I am in now. And they each have their unique challenges, but absolutely it's very different.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you have an observation about this as you're watching your daughter navigate this world. Like, do you see her grappling with some of the same things? This is directed both to Chuck Arnoldi and to Bill Clift.
It's definitely a different art world now. Art's sort of become a profession. I mean, because of the amount of people on the planet. And so many people go into the arts that I think a couple of generations ago wouldn't go into the arts, They would be looking for a more practical use of their life. And like she said, oh, you're going to be an artist? I mean, people would freak out. But now, I think everybody feels entitled to a college education. And so when kids get to the point where they're going to go to school, the parents say, what do you want to be? And I think they pick things like being an artist because it seems like an attractive job.
Mm-hmm.
And so the art world, too, has turned very business-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
So they're entering into a very weird art world. But I think with integrity in the work and uniqueness, it's individual to the person, that's how you ultimately will separate from the crowd. Mm-hmm. And fortunately for me, one of the great things is Natalie's work really is completely different from mine, which is really nice, because I have a lot of friends who are artists or whatever, and their children follow in that direction, and they emulate their parents' stuff. And I think that's a really tough place to be. And in Natalie's case,
Her style,
she's doing
her work
thing.
is so very different, yeah.
And she does ask me to come in and look, and I look, and she comes and looks at mine, but it's not criticism, but we watch each other's stuff, but it's really nice how different it is.
So I don't know if you all could hear that. Could everyone hear that? I mean, in a very synthesized and much less eloquent way, Chuck Arnoldi was talking about how different the art world is now, that it's been very professionalized, that it's much more of a business. It's driven by the market, really. But the importance of maintaining uniqueness and integrity. So I think that, are we at the point where I can open things up to questions from the audience for one or all of the artists here? Any questions?
I have a question.
Ava?
I'm curious as to whether you have ever tried to escape from being an artist. I have an artist son, and I understand that artists are born, that they really can't escape from what they need to do.
Did everyone hear that? Okay. Ava asked, actually, do you want to stand up and say it? Do you want to stand right in front of the camera and say it?
I don't need to be in front of the camera. I'm just curious as to whether any of our panelists have ever tried to escape the burden of being an artist. Because as we said before, it's not an easy life. And sometimes you must want to just simply have a job.
I will say, I don't think I ever wanted to escape being an artist per se, or that I've ever wanted to have a 9-to-5 job. But I will say that, I think that, just lost the train of my thought. How's that? I think that, when I went to law school, for example, what I wanted was to be well-equipped to do things in the art world. I thought I could do all of it. So I had always been able to do my art very seriously, throughout college. I would paint every night, literally. I would go photographing, every 2 or 3 days. So I had always been able to do everything. And then in law school, it became very clear that that would not be possible. So it really was a clear choice at that point. Am I going to follow this idea of, I don't know if I ever really even wanted to be a lawyer per se. I just wanted to be equipped to deal with things that might come up. But I do think that you are born an artist, and I think that, maybe a lot of kids are born artists, but they don't necessarily grow up in a family where people pay attention to what they do, and so they don't necessarily think it's a viable option. And I was fortunate to know that it was an option. So that's a short answer.
I've thought a lot about this, and mostly because art is there is no word for that in my language. Because art is not separate from life ever. That to be a good person is to be a creative person and to apply aesthetics to everything that you do. And when I was in grad school at RISD, I was really caught by that and why, as a Western culture, we've created art as something that's separate from how we move through the world. And I wrote my thesis about it, and the only sort of resources that I could find in theory and talking about the aesthetics of the everyday and relational aesthetics was through Japanese, some Japanese theory that was based on it's how you move through the world rather than what you separate as a special time to be creative versus my day, my 9 to 5. And so I struggle with this a lot currently because I feel like there are people who are still more aware of that space that we need to be in where we remember that we're all creators of this world. And that creative process is innate in every single human being. And it's our world and how we exist in this specific world right now that turns it into an economic endeavor or a specific, I work being creative from 3 to 5 p.m. Or I don't be creative from 8 to 5 at my desk job. And I think everything that I'm trying to do is deconstruct that thinking, because I think that's one of the main problems with our world. And I think that the idea of being an artist is not an option for anyone, actually. It's, if you can remember that it's how you open your refrigerator, it's how you move through the world, it's how you talk to people, it's where your foot goes in front of the other one. And yes, we might buy things and collect things that remind us of that, and it is the people who choose to be the reminders and make that their life goal that it is a responsibility. And I think it's if you can maintain consciousness in that responsibility is kind of where it's at, I guess, is the question for me.
What do you,
Beautifully said again.
what do you surround yourself with in your, I realize that this is going against what you said, that how you navigate through the world. So basically the world is your studio, but I know you have a studio space. What do you surround yourself with? Is it everyday objects?
I'm inspired. I like to see myself in other things, and if I can love myself, and I can be like Natalie was talking about, why would you go into a profession where you constantly doubt yourself? And it's true, because you're wandering into the unknown and the suspended disbelief all the time. And if you can maintain your foundation and keep your feet strong in that space, then you will do the best work. I truly believe, right? So in my studio, I find things and surround myself with the things that make me love myself more, and things that honor specific aesthetics that make rose, and the things that make me excited about wanting to go out there and do this work, and believe in myself, even on the days where I feel like, who the are you? What do you think you're doing, you crazy nut, right? And you go, but then there's Erica Baggio on a motorcycle, and then there's, Predator figurines, and I feel better.
Natalie and Carola, what do you think about it? Do you imagine, do you think of yourself as your artwork is becoming more Natalie or becoming more Carola? What's your perception of art? What is art to you?
Well, it's really interesting hearing you talk about how we create these boundaries of what is art and what it means to be creative. And I think about this a lot in being, straddling these two worlds of trying to be a scientist and trying to be an artist. And so much of what we do, if you really boil it down, comes down to creative problem solving and creative thinking. And whether it's as an artist, I have an idea of something I think would make an evocative and thought-provoking painting, or as a scientist, I come across a behavior or a phenomenon that we don't understand. The process of identifying what it is you want to communicate, and then thinking through the process of how you can present that to another person so that they understand whatever that concept or idea is the process is pretty similar. And I think it speaks to that I love the fact that you are a mechanic, because that is not a sphere that we think of as traditionally creative or as artwork, but it completely can be. And I think that if we can expand the boundaries of what we think of as creative or artistic, the work can be much more enriched.
I think what both Natalie and Rose have said is very appropriate to me as well. I think that, you draw from all aspects of your life and all aspects of what you are. And again, that's one of the most beautiful things about being an artist. And it does. It starts when you wake up in the morning and, continues, actually I would say it continues after you go to bed at night, and it is. I think that was beautifully said, about the way you walk through the world. All of those things go into your work, and it may seem to some people that I've kind of jumped from one thing to another, but it really has not been jumping or abandoning any one thing. It's really drawing from many, many ways really into life itself, I would say. Whether your lens happens to be a camera or music or the sciences philosophy, whatever it is, these are just ways to go in and out as well, because all directions. But yeah, I think it draws from all aspects of life.
So I realize I turned this over to the audience to ask questions, and then I co-opted it back. So let's just have 2 more questions from the audience. I see a hand. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to know where each one of you see yourself in 10 years. Where do you see yourself in 10 years?
Well, if I get into grad school, which I will find out this spring, the honest answer is I don't know. I will continue to make art. I love painting. I'm going to continue to paint. And I'm passionate about science and marine conservation and want to continue to practice in that as well. So I don't know. But some combination of those two.
Ambiguity is good.
Yes.
The same answer, I don't know, but certainly continuing to do what I'm doing. And I think one of the beauties of art is that it's not sort of a clear 10-year trajectory, whereas like if I had become a lawyer, say, okay, I go through law school, then you become, go to a firm, you do this, you do that, and it's much more drawn out, and so, no, I don't know, but I'll definitely still be doing what I'm doing in one way or another.
Well, I'll have an 11-year-old daughter in 10 years. And that matters a lot because all of a sudden it's not about me as much anymore, and it's about her and creating a world for a female that's something that I want her to live in and be happy and healthy in. And so there's several ways I can do that is, support her financially and create a comfortable world for her. And another way is to keep working super hard to bring consciousness to the world so that the world that she walks in as an adult will be different than this one we're in now. And part of that is how can I reach more people? And how can I open more eyes? And how can my work get out there in new ways? And I'm writing a book is another way to do this, and I'll graduate in May with another master's degree in creative nonfiction. And I just want somehow to reach more and more people. And not for me, but for her, but for this world that she's stepping into as a pretty girl too, as a beautiful person. I'm scared for her and what she'll come into because of what I've seen. And I don't want her to have to go through what I went through, so I'll do whatever I can to keep her happy, healthy, and safe.
Does she spend time in your studio?
Yeah, my mom's like karma, man. Yeah, there's another generation where I'm trying to work and she's like got the knife and she's stabbing. I'm like, okay, well this is turning into a collaboration and luckily enough for me, my work is more about the process and I'm more forgiving in that process. So I'm more okay with her attacking my work to a certain degree. She is, now that she can walk and get into my tools and eat the clay, yeah, it's a full-on, working in my studio is almost like jujitsu. My mom's just like, and I was fixing a short on my Harley, and she was just all into the mechanics too. She was covered in grease. Yeah, so we'll see who she becomes.
One final question? I think that was a beautiful way to end.